Cool, so thanks everyone for coming. I'm Juliet Williams, I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Arts. My area of research is around the kind of omission of race from theorisation and kind of feminist activism, and also looking at the omission of race in kind of feminist popular culture. So today I'm kind of focusing on the omission of issues of race in contemporary American postfeminism, although a lot of the kind of theories or issues that I'm looking at aren't specific to America or the United States, but are more kind of transatlantic, I guess. So I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to start with a short clip from the 2015 Emmy Awards, and it features Viola Davis, who some of you might be familiar with, accepting her Lead Actress Award.
And the Emmy goes to Viola Davis, How to Get Away with Murder.
This is the first Emmy win and nomination for Viola Davis, who is a graduate of Juilliard.
In my mind, I see a line. And over that line, I see green fields and lovely flowers and beautiful white women with their arms stretched out to me over that line. But I can't seem to get there no how. I can't seem to get over that line. That was Harriet Tubman in the 1800s. And let me tell you something. The only thing that separates women of color from anyone else is opportunity. You cannot win an Emmy for roles that are simply not there. So here's to all the writers, the awesome people that are Ben Sherwood, Paul Lee, Peter Nowak, Shonda Rhimes, people who have redefined what it means to be beautiful, to be sexy, to be a leading woman, to be black. And to the Taraji P. Hensons, the Kerry Washingtons, the Halle Berrys, the Nicole Beharies, the Megan Goods, to Gabrielle Union, thank you for taking us over that line. Thank you for the Television Academy. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the September 2015 Emmy Awards, and Viola Davis became the first ever African-American woman to win the Lead Actress Award in the Television Academy's 66-year history. So her speech is significant as it kind of highlights her achievement over her white contemporaries. And she also quotes Harriet Tubman, who, for those of you who aren't familiar with her, is a celebrated ex-slave and abolitionist who led kind of hundreds of slaves from the American South to freedom in the North in the kind of mid-1800s. So by quoting Tubman, Davis's speech really becomes a measure of the kind of lack of progress made in a kind of century-and-a-half long period. So her speech highlights this specifically in comparison to the gains of white women, especially politically, socially and culturally, and particularly more recently for women of colour having less opportunity or kind of facing more kind of inequality in economic, social and cultural spheres. So in this seminar, I'm really going to draw upon established theories of intersectionality and whiteness to explore the positioning of women of colour, particularly in the United States, as other or outside of mainstream post-feminist discourse. With reference to Davis's speech, I'll highlight the line that continues to separate the experiences of white women and women of colour, not only in kind of contemporary post-feminist theorisation and popular culture, but more widely across political, social and cultural spheres in the US. I think it's kind of important to note at this point that I'm exploring already kind of established theories of intersectionality and whiteness, but what I'm kind of aiming to do is bring those to the forefront in terms of our investigation of feminism and also popular culture, and really kind of establish them in those kind of feminist spheres and our theorization of feminism. So, investigating feminism's kind of whiteness or exclusivity is nothing new, as many of you might be aware. From the kind of early 1980s onwards, scholars and popular critics have condemned the exclusivity of feminist movements, and particularly that of the second wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, with notions of the feminine mystique that reflected the experiences of a very specific demographic of white middle-class women in the United States, but in the West kind of more widely. The period following the demise of the second wave feminist movement sees the emergence of what we kind of often refer to as alternative feminist discourses. So black feminism, gay feminism, and the kind of emergence of post-feminism. And these really kind of interact with the intersectional nature of women's experiences and speak more so to women of minority or colour or class in a way that mainstream feminism, especially the second wave feminist movement, had not. So black feminist scholars in particular kind of theorised the notion of intersectionality. And Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who was a black feminist scholar and activist in the 1980s, states that black women are often excluded from feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often does not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender. So in other words, we cannot come to understand the experiences of women of colour without first comprehending their experiences of racism and sexism as closely interlinked and as a unique form of discrimination, which may be likened to or similar to the experiences of white women or black men. However, despite this progress and the kind of theorisation of intersectionality within feminist spheres, the recognition of structures of patriarchal and racial hierarchy in feminist thinking have kind of remained largely on the outside of mainstream feminist discourses, and most notably in the last kind of 15, 20 years, that of post-feminism. So the term post-feminism, some of you might be familiar with post-feminism. The term post-feminism really emerged in the kind of early 1980s to refer to the decline in the second wave feminist movement, in the decline in second wave feminist ideology. However, it's not until the 1990s that the conceptualization of post-feminism becomes kind of mainstream. And for early post-feminist critics, academic and kind of popular, the concept of post-feminism came to be defined through its emergence as a seemingly oppositional discourse, which rejected the need for political feminist activism in favour of the notion that gender equality had already been achieved. A significant trait of post-feminism for many is its emergence as a kind of non-political or even anti-feminist shift that kind of reflects the ideologies and expectations of a new generation of women, combining ideas of second-wave feminism's successes and expectations of equality with the concepts of individualism, of choice, and the re-emergence of commodified femininity. And this is kind of predominantly through popular culture. So more recent kind of post-millennial arguments that favour post-feminism shift away from the political have become ever more endorsed, with notions of post-feminism shifting from that of the anti-feminist to a site in which women can find feminist agency and a positive space which allows for individuality and encourages feminist thinking among women who are previously excluded or felt detached from mainstream feminist discourse. However, I think this argument is kind of largely problematic, as it speaks to those who hold a kind of established place within the feminist narrative. So post-feminism's potential to act for a site as a site for individual feminist agency really relies on there being an already established and inclusive feminist sphere in which women can position themselves and address their own feminist ideologies, determine their own feminist ideologies and agency. So for women of colour then, or minority, who have consistently remained on the outside of established feminism as a result of their intersectional experiences of oppression, it remains challenging to find agency in a sphere that does not speak to you. As such, despite the theorisation of intersectionality by black feminist critics and activists in the 1980s, post-feminism has remained ideologically white in both its academic theorisation and its manifestation in popular culture. As stated by post-feminist critics Yvonne Tasker and Diane Negra, post-feminism remains white and middle class by default. I think this notion of post-feminism's whiteness is important to kind of tease out here. Whiteness scholar Veron Ware defines the notion of whiteness not in terms of its the kind of physical attribute of having white skin or light skin, but the mentality which comes to define structures of privilege which are born out of global colonisation, and that the belief to be white is to be better, more advanced and more desirable. So this notion can be likened to that of kind of institutionalised racism, whereby society unconsciously places value on white ways of thinking and doing, or disregarding or othering non-white equivalents. And this results in a kind of continued reinforcement of unconscious white supremacist thinking. So the theorisation of whiteness as a kind of unconscious racial thinking is important in terms of our study of feminism, as it firstly kind of helps us comprehend constructs of race. It secondly helps us understand the origins of racism, and finally it helps us overcome racial discrimination. So as long as mainstream feminism continues to deal with issues of race as separate from those of gender and other axes of oppression, it continues to reinforce otherness and segregate racial oppression through acknowledging race as a kind of sideline issue. So in doing this, feminist scholars continue to reinforce unconscious racial thinking. So I mean, why then is Davis's speech so significant? Well, firstly, it highlights on a kind of very public stage, the ongoing issues of unconscious racial thinking in the 21st century United States and the kind of Western Hemisphere more largely. Secondly, it draws attention to how racial thinking is both reflected in and reinforced through popular culture and the industry. And while Davis's speech was celebrated by many worldwide, there were some who illustrated very publicly the lack of understanding around these issues of race. I think most memorably came these comments from white American soap actress Nancy Lee Grahn, who tweeted, "None of us get the respect or opportunity we deserve. The Emmys is not a venue for racial opportunity. All women are belittled." Despite the minority of people who agreed with her comments, her tweet was largely criticised, not just in the US, but around the world, with many calling for her to check her own privilege. I think the tweet really exemplified the lack of awareness surrounding the engagement with issues of race and gender as a kind of double bind of oppression, especially from a kind of inherently more privileged white demographic. So understanding theories of intersectionality and race are fundamentally important to feminism's future, and as long as mainstream feminism continues to overlook race and other kind of axes of oppression in its theorisation, in its activism and its manifestation in popular culture, it will continue to fail in its drive for gender equality. With this in mind, I think it's important to acknowledge that the kind of growth of post-feminism and post-feminist popular culture in the 2000s may already be kind of in decline as we move into the kind of later half of this decade. The beginnings of the conceptualization of fourth wave feminism kind of came about in 2013 and demonstrated a kind of shift away from the kind of whiteness of post-feminism. And although still ambiguous in its kind of academic theorization and investigation, fourth wave feminism may be positioned as the new emerging feminism or feminist discourse, which has been defined loosely by scholars and popular critics as being enabled by the availability of the internet and also by kind of social media interaction on a global scale. So fourth wave feminism, while still young and ambitious in its kind of theorization, is both a product of a kind of new generation of feminist thinkers who are kind of native to the digital age in which we are now, and on that kind of global stage which we find through social media. So, I mean, some feminist critics are already dubbing it intersectional feminism because of that kind of global feel and the interaction between feminist thinkers from around the world. But if notions of kind of intersectional fourth wave feminism are to continue to grow and expand, it's not enough for white feminists and white feminist critics, myself included, to continue to investigate feminism and issues of gender without also investigating issues of race, of class, sexuality, and others that are kind of intrinsically interlinked. So for mainstream feminist critics, then, the challenge is to break the kind of repetitive and cyclical explorations of feminism as inherently white and to address the more kind of complex issues of the diversity of women's experiences and the implication of such diversity on the accessibility of contemporary feminist agency and participation. So in this seminar, I've kind of explored established theories of intersectionality and whiteness, highlighted the predominantly exclusive nature of feminism's past, and specifically that of kind of post-feminist theory and popular culture. And I've argued for the investigation into racial thinking to become embedded in feminist theory, as well as activism and its kind of manifestation in popular culture. The argument for more inclusive feminist thinking surrounding intersectional experiences of oppression, and specifically constructs of race as an axis of oppression, does not aim to reinforce kind of hierarchical racial thinking, but to understand and overcome it so that we can, as feminist and cultural scholars, we can drive progression towards eliminating the line that continues to separate women of colour from mainstream feminist discourses. So using Viola Davis's Emmy speech as a kind of illustrative case study of these issues, I hope to have kind of drawn your attention to the still very prevalent social and cultural racial hierarchy that continues to oppress women of colour, not just in the United States, but kind of globally as well. I hope to have kind of opened up more of a dialogue around these issues where a dialogue doesn't already exist. And that this dialogue will kind of inform your own thinking about issues of contemporary feminism and intersectionality. I think it's important to note that I'm kind of very aware that as a white feminist scholar and cultural critic, my understanding of these issues does in no way equate to the kind of lived experiences of racial and gendered oppression. And I think this is important to remember in our own investigations of these issues. So for contemporary feminists and feminist scholars, the challenge is to erase the line that prevents women of colour or minority accessing the same opportunities as white women, and to open up the feminist sphere to become more inclusive of those who have previously been excluded from it. But moving forward, the question remains, how do we open up a predominantly white feminist sphere to be inclusive of the diversity of women and their intersectional experiences of oppression? While feminism remains confined within structures of patriarchy and racial hierarchy, this will be an ongoing and difficult challenge, but one which I think we must pursue. Thank you very much.